A flight attendant thought she was following her instincts when she quietly alerted security about a black man sitting in first class. Calm, quiet, and unassuming. Something about him made her uneasy, though she couldn't explain why. Moments later, officers boarded the plane and escorted him off in front of curious and whispering passengers. But just 10 minutes later, the officers returned, and so did the man. The flight attendant's face drained as she learned the truth: he wasn't just any passenger. What happened next left the entire cabin stunned and sparked a conversation no one expected. Stay with me, this is a story that challenges the way we see the world around us. Before we begin, let me know where you're watching from. And if you believe stories like this are important, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. The cabin of Flight 227 was steeped in the familiar, comforting symphony of air travel. Overhead bins slammed shut with the dull finality of latches clicking into place, while murmured conversations flickered like soft candle flames along the aisles. The air hummed with the anticipation of departure, the kind of quiet where people let their guard down, where the world felt smaller, contained within the thin walls of this plane bound for Chicago. Rosa knew this quiet well. She had worked as a flight attendant for over 15 years, and there was a certain rhythm to each flight, an unspoken choreography of movements and glances that told her when things were as they should be and when they were not. Her eyes drifted to first class, settling, almost unwillingly, on the man in seat 3A. David Booker sat with an ease that felt deliberate. His presence wasn't loud, nor did it demand attention the way some businessmen did when they swept into first class, rattling briefcases and barking into phones. No, David's stillness was sharper, like a needle resting on silk. He wore a dark, unadorned suit, the kind that belonged to no particular season. His leather briefcase neatly tucked beneath his feet. In his hands, a book sat half open, though his eyes weren't moving across the words. Something about him unsettled Rosa. It wasn't the way he looked at her, he hadn't even glanced up. Nor was it anything he'd done. In fact, it was the absence of anything that made her skin prickle. He was too quiet, too composed. She felt foolish for thinking it. But as Rosa passed him, she felt the weight of a thought she had long learned to suppress. It wasn't his calmness that disturbed her, it was the color of his skin. She hated herself for feeling it, hated the part of her that whispered, "You've seen the news, you know the stories." That old voice, the one shaped by headlines and half-truths, resurfaced in moments like this, when the world slipped into its cracks. She lingered near the galley, folding napkins she had already folded twice. "Did you see him?" Rosa whispered, leaning closer to Lisa, her fellow attendant. Lisa barely looked up from arranging the drink cart. "See who?" "The man in 3A." Lisa's eyes flicked toward the front of the plane. "What about him?" Rosa hesitated. "Something feels off." Lisa's brow arched, and a hint of amusement crossed her face. "You mean the black guy in first class?" Rosa winced. "I didn't say that. You didn't have to." Lisa's voice lowered, but there was no malice in it. "Look, I get it, but he's not doing anything." Rosa tried to shrug it off, forcing a light laugh. "Maybe I'm overthinking it." But the knot in her stomach didn't unravel. The minutes slipped by. Rosa moved through her routine, her hands adjusting seat belts and guiding passengers with mechanical ease. But her focus never strayed far from 3A. David Booker didn't shift in his seat. He didn't order a drink or ask for a pillow. He simply sat, eyes trailing over the pages of his book like a man watching the clock hands inch forward. When she passed by again, she saw the name on the cover, James Baldwin. Her throat tightened. It felt intentional. The plane began its slow taxi down the runway. Rosa's hand hovered over the intercom as she prepared to deliver the safety briefing. But her eyes drifted back to David. He glanced at his watch. The motion precise, practiced. Her heart quickened. Maybe it was nothing. Or maybe it was everything. By the time the plane reached the edge of the tarmac, Rosa made a decision. Her fingers wrapped around the intercom phone. "Ground control. This is Flight 227. We have a passenger in seat 3A that may require additional screening. Can you send someone to check before takeoff?" She hung up with a steadying breath, willing herself to believe this was just protocol, that she wasn't making something out of nothing. But deep down, she knew, it wasn't the protocol that unsettled her. It was the silence. The plane hummed with the quiet rustle of passengers settling into their seats. Outside the window, Rain began to tap softly against the glass, the droplets cutting diagonal streaks across the sky as if the heavens themselves were impatient. Rosa stood by the galley, her back pressed lightly against the cool metal counter, trying to steady her breathing. The cabin felt heavier now, not with the physical weight of bodies and luggage, but with something else, something invisible, yet palpable. She told herself she wasn't imagining it. The voice crackled softly over the intercom. Ground control, sending security to assess. Rosa exhaled, but the knot in her stomach tightened. David Booker sat in 3A, oblivious to the currents shifting around him. His hands rested on the open book in his lap, though Rosa suspected he hadn't turned a page since she last glanced his way. He wasn't reading, he was waiting. Waiting for what? She couldn't say. Minutes stretched longer than they should have. Rosa watched the clock above the cockpit door tick forward, each second pounding louder in her ears. Lisa nudged her gently. Still watching him? Lisa's voice dipped low, barely a whisper. I just want to make sure. Rosa replied, but she couldn't meet Lisa's gaze. Lisa's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. You know, sometimes we see ghosts that aren't really there. Rosa stiffened. I'm not seeing ghosts. No? Lisa leaned on the drink cart, arms folding lazily across her chest. Look, Rosa, I get it. I've been in this job long enough to know that feeling in your gut. But you have to ask yourself, is it him you're worried about? Or is it just the story you think he fits into? The words stung more than Rosa cared to admit. She opened her mouth to answer. But before she could, the cabin door hissed open. 2 airport security officers stepped inside, the crisp navy of their uniforms a stark contrast to the soft, neutral tones of the plane. Conversations quieted as passengers tracked their entrance with wide eyes. Rosa felt every glance that flickered between her and the officers, though no one said a word. David Booker didn't look up. The taller officer, a man whose face was carved by years of this same routine, approached David with deliberate steps. Sir, may we have a word with you? David's gaze lifted slowly from his book. He studied the officer for a moment, not with surprise, not with annoyance, but with something Rosa couldn't quite place. Calm, controlled. Of course, David replied, his voice smooth as glass. He placed the book gently on the tray table, his movements precise, like someone folding a fragile piece of paper. As he rose, the hum of whispers began to ripple through the cabin. He looks harmless, someone muttered a few rows back. Maybe that's the problem, came the hushed response. Rosa's heart pounded harder. David stepped into the aisle, his back straight, shoulders squared as if he had walked this path before, as if the act of being questioned was as familiar to him as breathing. He glanced once, briefly, toward Rosa. There was no accusation in his eyes, no anger, just recognition, and that, somehow, felt worse. The officers escorted David toward the front of the plane. As they passed Rosa, she caught the faintest trace of his voice as he spoke to them. I'd like to know what prompted this. No answer followed. As they disappeared into the jet bridge, Rosa became aware of how small the cabin suddenly felt, as if the walls had crept closer when she wasn't looking. Lisa was the first to break the silence. Well, she said, her voice dry. That escalated quickly. But Rosa didn't laugh. Her eyes lingered on David's abandoned book, still resting on the tray table. The name on the cover glared back at her, Baldwin. It felt less like a coincidence now. Minutes passed. Passengers shifted in their seats, their eyes darting toward the front of the plane, wondering and perhaps hoping for some kind of resolution. When David finally returned, he did so with the same quiet grace he'd left with. His briefcase swung lightly at his side, his footsteps measured and unhurried. He slid into his seat without acknowledging the curious glances that followed him. But Rosa noticed. She saw the subtle tightening of his jaw, the faint weariness in his expression. David Booker may have been calm, but he was not unaffected. She stepped closer, pausing by his seat as she pretended to adjust the overhead bin. Mr. Booker, she said softly, the words catching awkwardly in her throat. He looked up, eyes meeting hers with polite curiosity. Yes? She hesitated. Is everything all right? David studied her for a long moment. His expression softened, though it carried the weight of something unspoken. It's all right, he replied. You were doing what you thought was best. Rosa's breath caught. She wanted to thank him, to offer some kind of apology. But the words dissolved before they reached her tongue. Instead, David picked up his book, flipping back to the page where he left off, as though nothing had happened at all. But Rosa knew better. The silence between them said more than words ever could. The plane had taken to the sky, but Rosa felt as though it hadn't left the ground. Her body moved through the narrow aisle, offering small smiles, pouring coffee, responding to routine requests, but none of it felt real. It was as if she were watching herself from a distance, her mind lingering on the memory of David Booker being led away and his quiet, unsettling return. David sat with the same composure as before, flipping the pages of his book with the ease of a man who had nowhere else to be. There was something in that calmness that felt heavier now, as though it wasn't peace, but armor. And Rosa, against her will, kept glancing his way. It began with a whisper. A man in seat 5B leaned toward his wife, his voice just loud enough to breach the quiet. "I don't know why they let him back on." His wife frowned, barely raising her eyes from the paperback she clutched. "He passed whatever test they gave him, didn't he? I suppose." The man shifted, his eyes flicked toward David, lingering for a beat too long. "Still, doesn't sit right with me." Rosa caught the exchange, her throat tightening. She wanted to ignore it, wanted to dismiss it as idle chatter, but she couldn't. She'd heard that tone before, more times than she cared to count. It wasn't suspicion, it was certainty dressed in quiet restraint, the kind of certainty that didn't need facts to feel justified. And Rosa wondered, uncomfortably, if she had sounded the same when she first spoke to Lisa. Another hour passed. The cabin lights dimmed as most of the passengers surrendered to the lull of mid-flight drowsiness. Lisa had retreated to the galley, flipping absent-mindedly through a magazine, while Rosa moved to collect empty glasses and napkins. As she neared David's row, she hesitated. "Would you like anything else, Mr. Booker?" she asked softly, her voice betraying none of the turmoil beneath. David looked up, his eyes calm but unreadable. "No, thank you." But as Rosa reached to retrieve a cup from the tray table in front of him, she noticed the slightest shift in his gaze, a flicker of awareness that hadn't been there a second before. She followed his line of sight. A man from the back of the cabin was walking toward the front. His stride was slow, casual, but there was something in his expression that made Rosa's stomach sink. His eyes barely flicked toward David as he passed, but the tension in the air sharpened like glass beneath Rosa's feet. It was subtle, so subtle that no one else seemed to notice. But David had, his book lowered slightly, his hand resting on the cover. It wasn't fear, it was preparation. Rosa returned to the galley, but she could feel her pulse quickening. Lisa glanced up from her seat, eyebrow raised. "What's wrong now? Did you see the guy that just walked up front?" Rosa asked, voice low. Lisa smirked. "You're really on edge today." "I'm serious." Lisa set the magazine aside with a sigh. "Look, Rosa, I think you're making something out of nothing. The man in 3A isn't doing anything. And if you keep watching him like a hawk, the passengers are going to start noticing, if they haven't already." But Rosa shook her head. "I'm telling you, something's not right." Lisa leaned back, crossing her arms. "And what exactly do you think is going to happen?" "He's reading a book." Rosa's eyes narrowed. "Maybe that's what bothers me." Lisa laughed under her breath. But Rosa didn't join her. A soft ding echoed through the cabin. It was the call button from seat 3A. Rosa's breath caught. She straightened her uniform and walked briskly toward David. When she arrived, he was sitting upright, his book now closed. He gestured politely to the empty seat beside him. "Could you sit for a moment?" he asked. His tone was light, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. Rosa hesitated but lowered herself into the seat. David's eyes shifted, scanning the cabin as if measuring each person's presence. Finally, he turned to her. "Do you know what you're looking for?" he asked quietly. The question felt like it cut through Rosa's chest. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words faltered. David didn't wait for an answer. "I've been here before, Miss Rosa," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Different flights, different faces, but the story rarely changes." Rosa swallowed hard, her hands curling into fists in her lap. "I was just trying to be careful." "I know," David replied, "but sometimes what we think is careful is something else entirely." His words lingered in the air like smoke, difficult to dispel. "I don't blame you," he said after a moment. But the next time you feel that instinct, stop and ask yourself where it's coming from. Because I promise you, it's not always about me." Rosa's heart sank. She wanted to argue, wanted to explain, but she knew there was nothing to say that wouldn't sound hollow. David offered her a small nod, as if letting her off the hook. "I appreciate the seat," he said softly. Rosa stood, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. As she returned to the galley, she couldn't help but feel that the turbulence she was experiencing had nothing to do with the sky outside, and everything to do with herself. The plane sliced through the night sky, the hum of the engine settling into a low, steady drone. The cabin lights dimmed, casting a soft amber glow over the faces of passengers drifting into uneasy sleep. But Rosa wasn't sleeping. She stood in the galley, her back pressed against the narrow wall, her eyes fixed on the curtain separating first class from the rest of the plane. Beyond that thin fabric lay David Booker, reading in his seat like nothing had ever happened. Rosa exhaled, but the weight on her chest didn't lift. She had been on edge before, but now there was something else, a feeling she couldn't shake. The words David had left her with sat heavy in her ears. "Sometimes what we think is careful is something else entirely." And though he hadn't said it outright, Rosa knew exactly what he meant. Somewhere near the back of the plane, a muffled voice broke the quiet. Rosa barely paid attention at first. She was used to the occasional rustle of passengers moving around during late-night flights. But the voice grew louder. Lisa, still seated at the galley's edge, finally perked up. "Do you hear that?" Rosa nodded, stepping out. Halfway down the aisle, a man in coach stood with his phone pressed tightly to his ear, pacing as far as the cramped rows would allow. His voice was sharp, curt, the kind of tone people use when they know others are listening but want them to pretend they aren't. "I don't care what they said. I saw the way you looked at me," the man hissed. "I'm not making this up." Rosa felt her pulse quicken. The man's eyes shot toward the front of the plane, toward David's seat. She didn't need to hear the rest. She already knew. Rosa approached calmly, gently tapping the man's shoulder. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to lower your voice. Passengers are trying to sleep." The man's eyes narrowed, but his phone lowered just a fraction. "I'm just talking to my wife," he muttered, as if the explanation justified the glare still lingering in his expression. "I understand," Rosa replied, her voice even, "but please keep it down." The man gave a tight nod. But as Rosa turned to leave, she caught the tail end of his next sentence, low but deliberate. "It's always the quiet ones. You never know what they're planning." Rosa's stomach twisted. She made her way back toward the galley. But the calm she had tried to summon was already fraying at the edges. Lisa leaned in as Rosa sat down beside her. "That was about him, wasn't it?" Rosa nodded. Lisa sighed, shaking her head. "This is getting ridiculous." But Rosa didn't respond, because what frightened her wasn't just the man's words, it was the fact that part of her still felt like he wasn't entirely wrong. The hours crawled by. David Booker never moved. His composure never wavered. It was Rosa who felt unraveled. Every few minutes, her eyes would flick toward his seat, searching for some sign, some clue that might betray what she couldn't explain. But there was nothing. It wasn't until the plane dipped slightly, a subtle descent that signaled their approach to Chicago, that David finally closed his book. And that was when Rosa saw it. It wasn't much, just a brief glance, but for the first time since the flight began, David's gaze swept over the cabin. Slowly, purposefully, he looked at the passengers around him, the man in coach who had whispered too loudly, the couple in row 5 who had exchanged wary glances, the flight attendants still pretending not to watch him. It wasn't a look of defiance. It was a look of knowing. As if David had been aware of every word, every thought, every unspoken accusation since the moment he boarded the plane. The seatbelt sign dinged. Passengers shifted, adjusting their seats, preparing for the final descent. David did the same, but as Rosa passed by to ensure everyone was buckled in, he stopped her with a simple nod. She paused, meeting his eyes one last time. "You were right," Rosa said quietly. She didn't know why she said it. The words slipped out before she could pull them back. David's gaze softened, but there was no satisfaction in his expression. No pride. He simply nodded. "Sometimes," he replied, "being right feels worse." Rosa wanted to say something more, to fill the space between them with an apology, an explanation, anything. But the plane began to descend, and the moment passed. as the wheels touched the ground and the plane taxied to the gate. Rosa glanced out the window. The rain had stopped, but the sky was still heavy with clouds. By the time the doors opened and passengers began to disembark, David Booker was gone, vanishing into the crowded terminal without a trace. And yet, as Rosa stood at the exit, her eyes trailing the passengers as they disappeared one by one, she couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't truly left at all. He remained there, in the quiet spaces between thoughts, a reminder of the thin line that separated caution from fear. And of the cost of crossing it. The airport terminal was alive with movement, hurried footsteps, rolling luggage, voices colliding in the sterile air. Rosa stood at the gate, watching as passengers filed past her, their eyes glazed with the exhaustion that came after hours in the sky. But David Booker was nowhere to be seen. He had slipped into the crowd without a word, and though Rosa's eyes swept the terminal more times than she could count, he was gone. Still, the weight of his presence lingered. It pressed against Rosa's chest as she followed the other crew members toward the lounge, each step feeling heavier than the last. Lisa walked beside her, scrolling absently through her phone. But Rosa's thoughts were far from the usual post-flight chatter. She couldn't let it go. Inside the crew lounge, the hum of overhead lights filled the silence. Rosa poured herself a cup of lukewarm coffee, the bitter taste doing little to shake her from the fog that had settled over her. Lisa flopped onto the worn leather couch, sighing dramatically. "You're still thinking about him, aren't you?" Rosa didn't bother denying it. "It's not just him," she said after a pause. "It's everything that happened around him. The way people watched him. The way they whispered." Lisa glanced up from her phone, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Look, I get it, but you said it yourself, he didn't do anything. He wasn't the problem." "No," Rosa murmured, "but maybe we were." Lisa's phone lowered. Rosa felt the weight of her friend's gaze, the unspoken challenge behind it. "Do you know how many times I've seen this happen?" Rosa continued, her voice quiet but tight with frustration. "I've watched men like him get pulled aside, questioned for no reason. I've seen people grip their bags a little tighter when someone like David walks by. And I used to think I was different, that I wasn't part of it. But tonight," her voice trailed off. Lisa set her phone down, leaning forward. "You're being hard on yourself." "Am I?" Rosa shot back, the sudden edge in her tone surprising even herself. "I called security on him, Lisa. I didn't know why, I just felt something. And that was enough." Silence stretched between them. Rosa's hands tightened around the coffee cup, the ceramic warm against her skin. Lisa exhaled, leaning back. "Rosa, it's not just you. It's all of us. This isn't new." And that, Rosa thought bitterly, was the problem. Later that evening, Rosa found herself wandering the quiet terminal alone. Her shift was over, and most of the crew had already left for their hotels. But she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something unfinished. She walked the length of the terminal, the echo of her footsteps following close behind. Somewhere near the end of Concourse B she caught sight of him. David Booker stood by a row of windows, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat, gazing out at the tarmac where planes glittered beneath the heavy clouds. For a moment, Rosa hesitated. She thought about turning around, letting him disappear into the night like he had before, but her feet carried her forward. David must have sensed her approaching because he didn't flinch when she stopped beside him. "You found me," he said, his voice calm but without surprise. Rosa swallowed hard. "I wasn't looking for you." David smiled faintly. "Weren't you?" Rosa let out a shaky breath, leaning against the window beside him. "I wanted to say I'm sorry," she admitted. David didn't respond right away. His eyes remained fixed on the runway, where a plane had just begun to ascend into the night sky. "You don't have to apologize," he said finally. "I've heard those words enough times to know they don't change much. But I mean it. I believe you," David replied softly. "But it's not about what you meant. It's about what happened." Rosa's chest tightened. She didn't have an argument for that because he was right. David shifted, turning to face her. "I don't hold grudges, Miss Rosa. I know the world you live in, the world I live in, and I know that sometimes fear dresses itself up as caution. But the problem isn't that you felt it. The problem is what happens next." "What do you mean?" David's eyes darkened, though his tone remained gentle. "Fear is like water. If you leave it unchecked, it seeps into every crack until it reshapes everything it touches. And before you know it, you're drowning in things you never thought you'd believe." Rosa's gaze dropped to the floor. I never thought I'd be that kind of person, she whispered. David studied her for a long moment. None of us do, he said, until we are. His words hit her harder than she expected. Rosa opened her mouth to respond, but David stepped back, his hands slipping from his pockets. It's late, he said, offering her a small nod. You should get some rest. Rosa wanted to stop him, wanted to ask him to stay, not because she needed more answers, but because the thought of watching him walk away, carrying that same quiet weight, felt unbearable. But David was already moving, his figure blending into the shadows of the terminal. And this time, Rosa let him go. As she stood by the window, the reflection of the tarmac shimmering beneath the rain, she realized that David's absence felt louder than his presence ever had. Because sometimes, the things we fail to confront don't disappear. They follow us long after the doors close and the engines fade. The rain had started again by the time Rosa left the terminal. It was the kind of rain that didn't fall hard, but lingered, a mist that soaked you slowly until you were colder than you realized. She tugged her jacket tighter around her shoulders, but the chill had already settled somewhere deeper. The hotel shuttle was late. Rosa stood under the flickering lights of the airport curb, shifting from foot to foot, watching taxis glide past, their headlights slicing the wet pavement. Somewhere in the distance, she thought she saw David Booker stepping into one of the cars, his figure barely visible through the sheen of rain on the glass. But it might have been her imagination. She wasn't sure anymore. By the time Rosa reached the hotel, the exhaustion had begun to creep in. The flight, the terminal, David's words, all of it hung over her like a storm cloud that refused to pass. Lisa had offered to grab dinner, but Rosa declined. She needed quiet, though she wasn't sure if silence was a friend or an enemy tonight. In the dim glow of her hotel room, Rosa sat by the window, the faint hum of city life drifting up from the streets below. She tried to read, tried to sleep, but her mind kept circling back to the same question. Why had she called security on him? She remembered the moment with excruciating clarity, how her hand had hovered over the intercom, how her heart had tightened with the certainty that something felt off. But what had she seen? Really? A black man, alone, quiet, and that was enough. Rosa let out a shaky breath, pressing her palms into her lap. David had been right. It wasn't about what she meant. It was about what had happened. The next morning, Rosa boarded another flight, a different route, different passengers, but as she moved down the aisle, smiling as she helped people with bags and strollers, she felt a strange sense of déjà vu. She glanced at seat 3A, and for a split second, she expected to see David sitting there, his calm eyes meeting hers with that same quiet knowing. But the seat was empty. Still, the weight of him remained. Mid-flight, Rosa found herself near the back of the plane, pouring coffee for an elderly woman who reminded her of her grandmother's soft eyes. The kind of face that looked like it had seen too much but had learned to carry it with grace. "Thank you, dear," the woman said, wrapping her hands around the cup. "You're welcome," Rosa replied automatically. The woman glanced up at her. "You seem distracted," she observed. Rosa blinked. "I'm fine," she said. "Just a long day." The woman's eyes narrowed slightly, as if she could see right through the mask Rosa had carefully put on. "Sometimes," the woman said softly, "the things we carry weigh more than we realize." Rosa froze. She thought about David, about the heaviness he had carried without ever showing it. Was that what people saw in him? Or was that just Rosa's projection? "Yeah," Rosa said after a moment. "I think you're right." As the flight descended, Rosa found herself lingering by the galley, watching the passengers as they prepared to leave. Most would forget this flight by the time they reached their next gate. For them, this was just another part of the day. But for Rosa, the flights had started to feel different. It wasn't the work that had changed, it was how she saw the people. She wondered how many times she had let her assumptions steer her toward decisions she couldn't justify. How many times she had chosen to trust a feeling without questioning why it was there. And she wondered if David Booker had ever been surprised by it or if he had simply come to expect it. The thought left a bitter taste in her mouth. After the passengers disembarked, Rosa stepped onto the jet bridge, the empty plane looming behind her. She paused at the gate, her eyes scanning the terminal ahead. For a fleeting second, she hoped to see David again, hoped he would step out of the crowd, offer her that same small nod, and let her know that somehow All of this had meant something. But he didn't. And maybe that was the point. David Booker hadn't needed to return to show Rosa what she had missed. The lesson wasn't in his presence. It was in his absence. Because some truths didn't arrive with a crash. They settled quietly, like mist over water, changing the landscape, reshaping the reflection. And when you finally saw it clearly, you realized it had been there all along. The plane had been grounded for 2 hours. Passengers milled around the terminal, their faces etched with frustration as announcements crackled overhead, offering little comfort. A mechanical issue. They were told a delay that required patience. But Rosa had seen this before. She stood near the gate, arms folded, watching as the crowd shifted restlessly. And she knew it wasn't the broken plane keeping them there. It was the thin veil of suspicion that hung over Seat 3A. A different flight, a different day, but the same story, playing out again. This time, it wasn't David Booker. The man in 3A now was younger. His clothes less polished but his posture eerily similar, upright, calm, eyes steady as they flicked over the sea of faces that refused to meet his gaze. He hadn't said a word since the officers had boarded the plane. But he didn't need to. His silence did all the talking. Rosa watched as the officers stood near the jet bridge, their voices low as they debated next steps. One of them, a graying man with tired eyes, seemed unconvinced by whatever report had been passed along. The other, younger and stiffer in his uniform, looked eager, ready to act before reason could catch up. It was the younger one who approached 3A. "Sir, can you step off the plane with us for further questioning?" The young man in the seat, barely out of his 20s. Rosa guessed, looked up slowly, his brow furrowing just slightly. "Is there a reason?" he asked. Voice calm but firm. "It's just routine," the officer replied, but even he didn't sound convinced. Rosa took a step forward. She wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the way the young man's eyes mirrored David's from that night, resigned but unbroken. As though he had lived this moment too many times to count. Or maybe it was the cold realization that she had once been the person calling security. Lisa appeared beside her, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold with thinly veiled irritation. "Here we go again," Lisa muttered. Rosa glanced at her. "What do you mean?" Lisa huffed. "It's always the same. Someone looks at a black man sitting quietly, and suddenly he's a threat. We all pretend it's not about race. But come on, Rosa, we know what this is." Rosa's throat tightened. She wanted to argue, to insist that this time felt different, but she couldn't find the words. Because Lisa was right. It was always the same. The young man in 3A didn't resist. He rose, gathering his things with deliberate care, as if to show the watching eyes that he had nothing to hide. The officer led him down the aisle, and Rosa's gaze followed, her heart pounding louder with each step he took toward the exit. She remembered David's words from that night. "Fear is like water, it seeps into every crack." And Rosa could feel it now, leaking into the corners of this flight, pooling beneath every unspoken glance. By the time the young man disappeared down the jet bridge, the cabin was quiet, but Rosa could still hear the echoes of all the questions no one had asked aloud. Minutes passed, though they felt longer. Rosa stayed near the galley, pretending to organize supplies, but her focus was elsewhere. She could see the passengers shifting uneasily, whispering in hushed tones. "What do you think he did?" someone asked behind her. "I don't know," another replied, "but you saw how calm he was." People like that. Their voices trailed off, but Rosa didn't need to hear the rest. She already knew how the sentence ended. When the young man returned, the air in the cabin shifted. He walked with the same quiet dignity David had carried, sliding back into his seat without meeting anyone's gaze. The officers didn't follow, no explanation given, no apology offered, but Rosa knew what had happened. They had found nothing, because there was nothing to find. The young man leaned back, folding his arms across his chest, but Rosa caught the flicker of something behind his eyes, not relief, but exhaustion. This wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. As the plane finally lifted off, Rosa moved quietly down the aisle, pausing beside seat 3A. "Can I get you anything?" she asked softly. The young man looked up, his expression unreadable. "No, thank you," he replied. Rosa hesitated. "I'm sorry about earlier." For a moment, he didn't respond. Then, his lips curved into the faintest trace of a smile, not one of joy, but of recognition. "It's all right," he said. "I know how this works." Rosa's chest tightened, and she found herself searching for something to say, something that might carry more weight than empty apologies. But before she could speak, he added quietly, "It's not you I worry about. It's the ones who don't realize they're part of it." The words struck Rosa like a slap. She nodded, her voice caught somewhere between her throat and her heart. As she walked away, she felt the sting of the truth he had left behind. Because the hardest part wasn't confronting others. It was confronting herself. The plane cruised at 30,000 feet. But Rosa felt as if something far heavier than the aircraft was pulling her down. The hum of the engines blurred into the background, merging with the low murmur of voices that filled the cabin. Passengers had returned to their books, their in-flight movies, their quiet daydreams, but Rosa's attention lingered elsewhere. The young man in 3A sat with his eyes closed, head tilted slightly against the seatback. His stillness wasn't the ease of sleep. It was the stillness of someone who had learned to disappear without moving an inch. She envied how he carried it, but she hated that he had to. Lisa's voice pulled her from her thoughts. "Hey, Rosa." Rosa turned to see Lisa balancing a tray of empty cups. Her expression unreadable but her eyes sharp with curiosity. "Did you hear what the guy in 5B just said?" Lisa lowered her voice. Rosa's stomach tightened. "No." Lisa nodded toward the front of the cabin. Her voice hushed but clipped. "He asked me if we get nervous flying with men like him." Rosa felt the heat rise to her face. "Did you say anything?" Lisa smirked, but it wasn't the playful one she usually wore. "I told him we get nervous flying with all kinds of people. Some of them just talk more than others." Rosa wanted to laugh, but the sound caught in her throat. She could feel it, the slow creep of something darker threading itself through the air. Lisa leaned in closer. "This is how it starts," she muttered. "One person whispers something, and before you know it, everyone's seeing shadows where there aren't any." Rosa's grip tightened around the handle of the drink cart. "They're not seeing shadows," she whispered. "They're just looking for confirmation." Lisa paused, and for a moment, Rosa saw the flicker of understanding in her eyes. The turbulence started soon after. It wasn't the kind that jolted the plane violently, but it came in waves subtle enough to rattle the drink carts and send shivers through the cabin. Rosa moved down the aisle, steadying herself against the seats as she reassured passengers. But as she neared 3A, she felt it again, the pull, the weight of his presence. Not because he demanded attention but because of how deliberately he avoided it. The man's eyes opened as Rosa approached. He studied her calmly, but there was something else now, a question lingering between them that neither had spoken aloud. Rosa bent down, lowering her voice. "Is everything all right?" The young man nodded. "I'm used to turbulence." But Rosa wasn't asking about the turbulence in the sky. She opened her mouth to say more, but before she could speak, the ding of the intercom echoed overhead. "Ladies and gentlemen, the captain has turned on the seatbelt sign due to weather conditions ahead. Please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts." A ripple of tension passed through the cabin. As Rosa stood to return to the galley, she noticed the man in 5B staring directly at 3A. His gaze didn't waver, and Rosa knew, at that moment, it wasn't the turbulence that had the passengers on edge. The storm hit harder than expected. The plane dipped, and several overhead bins rattled under the weight of shifting bags. A gasp rippled through the cabin, followed by nervous laughter as the plane steadied itself. Rosa felt her heartbeat quicken. It wasn't just the storm outside. It was the storm inside, the one she could feel brewing in the glances, in the half-finished whispers, in the spaces between the rows where suspicion crept like smoke. Lisa's voice crackled through the crew intercom. "Rosa, can you check on row 5? Rosa already knew why. When she reached 5B, the man looked up at her expectantly, as if waiting for permission to voice what he had been holding back. "Miss," he said, loud enough for the surrounding passengers to hear, "I just thought you should know that the man up there 3A, he's been acting strange." Rosa's jaw tightened. "What do you mean by strange?" The man shrugged, leaning back in his seat but keeping his voice just loud enough to carry. "He's too quiet. Doesn't seem normal to me." A few heads turned. Rosa felt every eye boring into her, waiting for her response. She forced a breath. "Sir, I can assure you there's nothing unusual about him." The man's lips thinned. "I'm just saying, with everything you see on the news these days, maybe it wouldn't hurt to double-check." Rosa's pulse pounded in her ears. She glanced toward 3A. The young man hadn't moved, but Rosa could tell he was listening. His eyes stayed fixed on the window, as if he could will himself invisible by sheer force of will. She turned back to 5B. "Sir," she said, her voice firm but calm. "We don't question people because they're quiet." The man's eyes narrowed. "Maybe you should." Rosa's hands trembled as she returned to the galley. Lisa caught her eye immediately. "I heard," Lisa said quietly. Rosa didn't respond, because now she understood the weight David had carried, the burden of being watched. Measured against expectations he never agreed to meet. And no matter how still the plane sat in the sky, Rosa could feel it sinking. After the plane landed, Rosa lingered near the exit. Passengers shuffled past, their conversations light, as if the tension had evaporated the moment their feet touched solid ground. But when the young man from 3A approached, Rosa straightened. He paused briefly at the door, glancing at her with the faintest flicker of curiosity. "I appreciate what you said," he offered quietly. Rosa's throat tightened. "I should have said more." The young man nodded, and for a moment, Rosa saw David Booker in his eyes, that same calm, that same quiet endurance. "You'll get there," he replied, stepping out into the terminal without another word. And Rosa was left standing there, realizing that the hardest turbulence wasn't the kind that shook the plane. It was the kind that followed you long after the flight had ended. The airport felt different after the flight. Not louder, not busier, just heavier. Rosa walked through the terminal as if moving underwater. The echoes of footsteps around her dull and distant. The crowd pressed forward, rushing to connecting flights or waiting loved ones. But she wasn't part of it. She drifted between faces she barely saw, her mind replaying the man's words from seat 5B. "He's too quiet. Doesn't seem normal to me." She had heard those words before. They had different shapes, different faces, but they always boiled down to the same thing. "You know how they are. I'm not racist, but it's not about race. It's about being careful." Careful. That word. It gnawed at her. Rosa pushed open the door to the employee lounge, but the familiar hum of vending machines and fluorescent lights didn't bring comfort. Lisa was already there, leaning against a counter, sipping weak coffee from a paper cup. "You're quiet," Lisa said, not looking up. Rosa didn't sit. "That man back in 5B. Rosa started, but Lisa waved her hand dismissively. "He's an idiot. Forget him." "I can't." Rosa crossed her arms, pacing by the window that overlooked the tarmac. Planes moved steadily below, their lights flickering in the early evening haze. Lisa sighed, setting down her cup. "What do you want me to say?" "Rosa, that guy's been trained his whole life to think like that. You're not going to undo it in one flight." "I know," Rosa said, her voice sharper than she intended. "But I'm starting to wonder if I'm trained the same way." Lisa raised an eyebrow. "What are you talking about?" Rosa turned to her, leaning against the glass. "I was him once," Rosa admitted. "Not as loud, not as obvious, but I've made the same call. Felt that same pit in my stomach just because someone like him." She motioned toward the empty air. But in her mind, she saw seat 3A was too quiet, too calm. "I thought I was being careful." Lisa didn't answer right away. "You're not wrong," she said eventually, her voice softer. "But you saw it. You're thinking about it. That's more than most people do." Rosa exhaled, staring out the window. "I don't think that's enough anymore." Later that night, Rosa found herself unable to sleep. Her hotel room felt cold despite the hum of the heater. The bed was comfortable, but she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the dark outlines of the room blurring into unfamiliar shapes. It wasn't about the man in 5B. She realized. It was about the silence that followed him. Because no one else had said anything. No one in first class. No one in coach. No one but her and Lisa had acknowledged what had happened. Rosa remembered the young man's face, the way his eyes carried something far older than his years. She had wanted to protect him, but the truth settled into her like a stone. By the time she spoke up, he had already protected himself. The next morning, Rosa moved through the airport in a daze. She had another flight, another route, but it all felt the same. The faces changed, but the patterns didn't. It wasn't until she passed by a familiar gate that she stopped. There, by the window, stood David Booker. He was alone, his briefcase resting by his side, his hands folded neatly in front of him. He wasn't watching the planes, he was watching the people. Rosa hesitated. For a fleeting moment, she considered walking the other way, letting him slip past her unnoticed. But something rooted her to the spot. She approached slowly, Her footsteps light against the tile. "Mr. Booker," she said, her voice tentative. David turned. His gaze settled on her with the same quiet recognition it always carried. "Miss Rosa," he greeted. There was no surprise in his tone. As if he had been expecting her. "I didn't think I'd see you again," Rosa admitted. David smiled faintly. "You'd be surprised how small the world gets when you pay attention." Rosa nodded, though she wasn't sure she entirely believed it. "I never apologized properly," she said after a moment. David's smile didn't fade, but there was something heavier behind his eyes. "You did," he replied, "not with words, but I saw it." Rosa swallowed. "There was someone else," she continued, her voice soft. "On another flight. It happened again." David's expression didn't change, but she could see the flicker of recognition in his face. "And you?" he asked quietly. "I tried to stop it," Rosa said, "but it wasn't enough." David studied her for a long moment, his gaze unflinching but kind. "It rarely is," he replied, "but the question isn't whether it's enough. The question is whether you'll keep trying." Rosa opened her mouth to respond, but no words came, because she realized, standing there, that David Booker wasn't offering comfort. He was offering responsibility. As David gathered his things and walked toward his gate, Rosa remained by the window, watching him disappear into the crowd. He didn't look back, and this time, Rosa understood why. The work wasn't his to finish. It was hers. The airport terminal felt quieter after David Booker left. Not literally, there were still announcements buzzing over the loudspeakers, and the constant shuffle of travelers filled the air. But for Rosa, the silence was internal, pressing down like an invisible weight she couldn't shake. She watched the crowd swell and shift, but she no longer saw them as she once had. They were no longer just passengers, no longer just bodies moving from one destination to the next. They were stories, questions, assumptions wrapped in human form. And she wondered how many she had judged before they'd even spoken. Her next flight boarded without incident. Rosa moved through the cabin, her hands steady as she checked seatbelts and adjusted luggage overhead. Everything was ordinary except it wasn't. Every glance felt longer. Every quiet passenger drew her attention. In seat 3A, there sat a middle-aged black woman, elegantly dressed in a soft blue sweater and holding a newspaper folded neatly in her lap. She smiled at Rosa as she passed, her eyes warm but distant, as if she had long since learned how to be pleasant without being inviting. Rosa smiled back, but the moment lingered. She caught herself wondering if this woman, too, was watching the plane differently than the others. If she sat quietly because experience had taught her that stillness was the safest form of resistance. "You'll get there," David had said, but Rosa wasn't sure she liked what there looked like. It wasn't until the plane reached cruising altitude that the first hint of trouble emerged. A man in seat 7D, broad-shouldered, with the kind of restless energy that filled every corner of his seat, began shifting, his eyes narrowing as they flicked toward the front of the cabin. Rosa caught him staring at the woman in 3A. She could see it building. The sideways glances, the slight frown that tightened his lips, the low hum of distrust that barely needed words to carry weight. It was starting again. Rosa moved toward him before he had a chance to speak. "Can I get you anything, sir?" she asked, keeping her tone light but firm. The man blinked, as if pulled from his thoughts. "No," he said quickly, shaking his head. "I'm fine." But Rosa lingered for just a moment longer, long enough for him to shift his attention elsewhere. As she turned back toward the front of the plane, she caught the woman in 3A watching her. Their eyes met briefly, and there was an understanding there, unspoken, but undeniable. The woman nodded ever so slightly, as if to say, "I saw that, and I've seen it before." The flight remained calm for the next hour. But Rosa felt it brewing. It wasn't just the man in 7D. She could sense it in the murmurs that passed between passengers, the small glances that flicked toward 3A. It was subtle, the way fear disguised itself as curiosity. And Rosa knew it was only a matter of time before it surfaced. She remembered the last flight, how long it had taken her to say something. How David Booker had been left to carry the burden alone. She wouldn't let it happen again. When the man in 7D finally pressed the call button, Rosa was already there. He leaned closer as she approached, lowering his voice but keeping the edge sharp. "Listen, I don't mean to make a big deal out of this, but the woman up there, she hasn't said a word the whole flight. And she keeps looking around. Rosa's chest tightened. "Sir," she replied, her voice carefully even, "I can assure you there's nothing to worry about. I'm just saying," he continued, not ready to let it drop. "You can't be too careful these days." Rosa straightened, her eyes hardening. "Sir," she said again, louder this time, "there is nothing to worry about." The nearby passengers turned to listen. The man frowned but said nothing more. He slouched back into his seat, crossing his arms tightly over his chest. But Rosa felt the shift. People were watching now, not just him, her, the crew, the quiet woman in 3A, the passengers who didn't speak but listened closely. And Rosa realized, perhaps for the first time, that silence could be loud when it needed to be. As the plane began its descent, Rosa returned to 3A. The woman looked up from her newspaper, folding it delicately as Rosa approached. "Is everything all right?" Rosa asked softly, though she already knew the answer. The woman smiled faintly. "It usually is," she replied, "once someone decides to step in." Rosa's throat tightened, but she nodded. "I'm sorry," she said. The woman's smile didn't fade. "I appreciate that," she replied, "but you don't need to apologize for doing what's right." When the plane landed, Rosa stood by the exit as passengers filed out. The woman in 3A was among the last to leave. As she passed Rosa, she paused briefly. "Thank you," the woman said softly. Rosa opened her mouth to respond, but the woman was already gone, disappearing into the terminal with the quiet grace of someone who had learned long ago that leaving was sometimes the safest thing one could do. Lisa joined Rosa at the door, watching the passengers fade into the crowd. "You handled that well," Lisa said, nudging her shoulder. "Not well enough," Rosa replied, her voice distant. Lisa arched an eyebrow. "You stopped him before it got worse." Rosa shook her head. "I didn't stop him, I just slowed him down." Lisa didn't answer, because they both knew the truth. It was never just one man, just one flight, just one call to security. It was the storm beneath the surface, the one that stretched across every flight, every terminal, every quiet glance exchanged in the shadows of suspicion. Rosa could feel it now, pressing against the edges of her reflection as she stared out the window at the dark sky beyond. And for the first time, she wondered if the real turbulence wasn't in the air, but down there, on the ground. The airport terminal was a strange place after midnight. Gone were the families with strollers and the eager vacationers rushing toward distant beaches. What remained were the restless, the drifters between destinations, the ones with tired eyes and too much time on their hands. Rosa stood by gate 42, watching as the terminal emptied out, leaving behind only a few scattered passengers waiting for the red-eye to Atlanta. It was the end of her shift, but she didn't feel ready to leave. The woman from 3A lingered in her thoughts like a name she couldn't recall. A reminder that the work Rosa had stepped into wasn't something she could clock out of. She thought of David Booker, too, and how he had quietly disappeared, leaving her with a mirror she hadn't asked for. Lisa walked up beside her, dragging her carry-on behind her. "You all right?" Lisa asked, peering at Rosa with that knowing look she always wore when something was stirring beneath the surface. "I'm fine," Rosa replied, but the lie tasted bitter. Lisa didn't push. She never did. Instead, she smiled softly and said, "You know, we can't save the world one flight at a time." Rosa smiled back, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Maybe not," Rosa said, "but sometimes it feels like we're just trying to keep it from falling apart." Lisa's smile faded, and she gave a small nod before disappearing into the crowd, leaving Rosa alone beneath the flickering terminal lights. The red eye was half full, and the plane hummed with the soft rhythm of night travelers settling into uneasy sleep. Rosa watched from the galley as the cabin drifted into silence. But she had learned that silence didn't always mean peace. A man near the front 4D hadn't touched his seatbelt. He sat rigid, his eyes fixed somewhere beyond the seat in front of him. There was tension in his shoulders, the kind that didn't come from a fear of flying. Rosa knew that look. She had seen it too many times. Her feet moved before her mind could catch up. "Can I get you something?" she asked, her voice soft as she leaned toward him. The man blinked and looked up, startled. "No," he said quickly, shaking his head. "I'm fine." Rosa nodded but didn't step away. She saw the way his gaze flicked toward another passenger, a young black man sitting a few rows ahead. The man in 4D tried to hide it, but Rosa saw the stiffness in his jaw, the subtle tightening of his grip on the armrest. There it was. The thing no one said aloud. Rosa straightened. "If you need anything," she added, her voice just loud enough for the rows around them to hear. "Let me know." Her eyes lingered on him for a moment longer, not as a threat, but as a warning. He nodded silently. As Rosa walked back to the galley, she felt the shift ripple behind her. Subtle but undeniable. The man's discomfort was not unique. It was shared quietly by those who wouldn't voice it but carried it just the same. Halfway through the flight, the turbulence began. It was light at first, just enough to make the seatbelt sign flicker on. But by the time Rosa began her rounds again, the cabin felt heavier, as if the air itself was thickening. In seat 4D, the man's gaze hadn't shifted. He was still watching. Rosa felt the hair rise on the back of her neck. The young man he was watching, quiet, headphones in, staring out the window, hadn't moved the entire flight. He didn't seem aware of the weight being placed on him. Or perhaps he was, but he had simply grown accustomed to it. Rosa's hand hovered over the intercom. She remembered how easy it had been to make the call on David Booker. How simple it had felt, in the moment, to choose suspicion over understanding. She wouldn't make that mistake again. But the man in 4D wasn't letting it go. As Rosa approached his row again, he stopped her with a raised hand. "Excuse me," he said, leaning toward her. His voice was low, but there was urgency in it. "Is that man up there supposed to be sitting in first class?" Rosa's heart pounded. She forced a smile. "Yes, sir. He has a ticket, just like everyone else." The man frowned. "I don't know. Something about him." Rosa's expression hardened. "Sir," she interrupted gently, but firmly, "I need you to understand something." The man blinked, surprised by her tone. She leaned closer. "The only thing unusual about that man," Rosa said slowly, "is that people like you keep watching him." The words hung between them, sharp and unrelenting. The man's face reddened slightly, but he said nothing more. Rosa straightened and walked away, not bothering to check if his eyes followed her. As the plane descended, Rosa moved quietly through the cabin, ensuring everyone was ready for landing. When she reached the young man's row, she hesitated. "Is everything all right?" she asked, keeping her voice low. He looked up, surprised by the question. "Yeah," he replied, removing his headphones. "Why?" Rosa smiled faintly. "No reason. Just wanted to make sure you were comfortable." The young man's gaze lingered for a moment. Then, as if understanding something unspoken, he nodded. "Thank you," he said. Rosa didn't reply. She didn't need to. After the plane touched down and the passengers began to disembark, Rosa stood near the door, watching each one leave. When the man from 4D passed by, he didn't meet her eyes. But the young man paused. He looked at Rosa with a quiet, knowing expression, one she recognized from David Booker. It wasn't gratitude. It was recognition. A shared understanding of a world that wasn't always fair, but one that sometimes found its justice in the smallest of moments. As he disappeared into the crowd, Rosa stood a little straighter, the weight on her shoulders a little lighter, because she knew now that silence wasn't enough, and neither was comfort. Sometimes, you had to stand in the storm even when it wasn't yours. The terminal was quiet now, save for the occasional echo of footsteps against the polished floor. Rosa stood by the window, her reflection staring back at her against the backdrop of the tarmac. The plane she had just disembarked from sat still in the night, its lights dimming one by one, as if the aircraft itself was exhaling after the weight of the journey. She watched as the last few passengers disappeared into the arteries of the airport, vanishing down corridors that stretched toward destinations she'd never know. But Rosa couldn't move. Her eyes traced the empty gate, searching for something or perhaps someone that wasn't there. Lisa's voice finally broke the silence behind her. "You're still here?" Lisa set her bag down, leaning against the same window, following Rosa's gaze out onto the tarmac. "I needed a minute," Rosa replied softly. Lisa gave her a knowing look, but her voice carried a lighter tone. "You're starting to sound like him." Rosa didn't need to ask who him was. David Booker's presence had lingered far longer than his seatbelt had been fastened. Maybe it always would. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the rain collect in thin streams against the runway lights. "It happened again tonight," Rosa finally said. Lisa's eyes narrowed. "Who?" 4D. Rosa shook her head. "Same thing, different face." Lisa exhaled through her nose, her expression tightening as she processed the words. I shut it down early. Rosa added, but I still feel like I should have done more. Lisa considered this for a moment before crossing her arms. Look, Rosa, we work in the sky. But this was built on the ground. Lisa's voice was steady, but Rosa could hear the undercurrent of fatigue in it, the weariness of someone who had witnessed these moments more times than she could count. I know, Rosa said, but that doesn't make it easier. No, Lisa agreed quietly. It doesn't. The airport around them continued to thin. Passengers trickling out as the last flights of the night departed. Rosa couldn't stop thinking about the man in 3A and how, even after everything, he had walked off the plane as if nothing had happened. Because nothing did. That was the part Rosa couldn't shake. The storm hadn't erupted. No arguments. No confrontations. But the weight of it remained, hanging in the air like the echo of a distant thunderclap. She wondered if the young man had sensed it. Too, if he had felt the invisible thread of suspicion pulling at him every time a stranger's eyes lingered too long. You know, Lisa said, breaking the silence, there's something I read once. It said the hardest part about change isn't the big moments. It's the quiet ones, the ones where nothing happens, but everything shifts just a little. Rosa nodded slowly. Maybe that's why it feels so heavy. Rosa whispered. Lisa gave a small shrug. Maybe, or maybe it's heavy because we've been carrying it for so long we don't even notice anymore. Rosa thought about that as she left the airport that night. The streets were slick with rain, reflecting the lights of the terminal behind her. She moved slowly, as if each step required more effort than the last. She wondered if David Booker had left the same way quietly, his presence dissolving into the night like mist over the pavement. But she doubted it. David carried the storm with him. And Rosa? Rosa had just begun to feel the rain. The hotel room felt colder than usual. Rosa sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the blank television screen as her reflection flickered faintly against the dark glass. Her phone buzzed with messages from family, friends, people who existed outside the world of late-night flights and quiet reckonings. She ignored them all. Her mind was still with the young man in 3A, with the woman who had thanked her in quiet gratitude, and with David Booker who had left her with more questions than answers. The question isn't whether it's enough, David had told her. The question is whether you'll keep trying. Rosa lay back against the pillows, letting the words settle over her like a weight she no longer tried to shake. She didn't know if trying would ever be enough. But as the rain tapped softly against the hotel window, Rosa understood that trying was the only thing she could do. And maybe, just maybe, that was how storms were quieted. Not all at once, but piece by piece.